Hey, I'm Bacon. Dwarves are my favorite fantasy race of all time. I'd like to think I have a lot in common with the typical temperament of a standard fantasy dwarf, which is why I'm drawn to them as a character choice. But no matter how much I read about them, and no matter how familiar I am with their behavior, and no matter how long I grow this incredible beard, I'll never actually be one. I'll only ever have been exposed to human customs in my own upbringing, and I'll only ever have experienced the limits of human biology and all exclusively within the context of human society. So, I can observe dwarf insular societies and beer cultures and think that I get it, as there are certainly human analogs, but it won't be because of the cultural understanding I have from having been raised as a dwarf, which actually means I can never get it. I can emulate the temperament of a dwarf, but all that can ever be is an interpretation of dwarf behavior as captured through the lens of human understanding. Because of this, I can't actually roleplay a dwarf. No human can. We can roleplay humans pretty flawlessly, though. And that's what we always end up doing because all we can ever do is roleplay an interpretation of dwarf behavior, or elf, or whatever your favorite fantasy race is, as captured through the lens of human understanding. So, to adjust, we transform the dwarves and elves, etc., into humans, because humans can share culture with other humans in a way that we cannot with dwarves or elves because of how drastically different humans are from them. As just one example of our inability to meaningfully share understanding with dwarves, let's turn to Warhammer Fantasy Battles. According to some sources in the setting, dwarves can typically live to between 300 and 400 years old, and some can even live up to 600 years old for being runesmiths or rune priests. The power from working with runes adds longevity. Imagine how a 400-year-long lifespan would affect everything about your entire existence. You can put things in motion long term because you're going to be here for 400 years. Even the smallest slight will slow burn into a decades or centuries long grudge because emotions would simply be expressed differently, and hey, you have the time. This behavior is reasonable to a dwarf, but for a human who lives to be 80, emotional slights and conflicts are better resolved immediately so as to not consume too much time. And so this is how we roleplay the dwarf. He's just as likely to forgive as a human is because all of his emotions will be as fleeting as your human experience allows them to be, which again means you're not actually role-playing a dwarf, you're role-playing a human. Elves in the setting can live for thousands of years. They are to dwarves what dwarves are to humans, completely inscrutable. And this is based on just life expectancy. Adding in other considerations just widens the chasm. This is why, notably, most non-human character races across most role-playing games are largely considered human but different. It's why role-playing systems provide mechanical changes like stat bonuses to differentiate them from one another. Since they're just human but hardier, or human but prettier, or human but longer lived, there needs to be something to point to for a game system to be able to say, see, this is how they're different, humans and elves, or whatever. So here's some dark vision, or a +2 to constitution, you're a dwarf now, huzzah. But, like the standard hit points systems I've previously discussed, the reliance on these mechanical differences deviates from the focus of a role-playing game, which is roleplay. A bump to a stat or two is not fit for this purpose. You need actual insight into the culture, biology, and ability of a race that is drastically different from human and stands unique among all other player races in the game. And this can't come from an external source. All a book can do is tell you how a specific race is different from humans and how they are unique in their culture and society. You have to do the work in considering what that actually means. You can't just be a short, stocky Scot with a beard who likes beer and gold. You have to consider what it is about the culture that makes a dwarf emotionally aloof and societally isolationist. What about their history has influenced modern behaviors? What's the individual history of your dwarf character that's been influenced by his dwarf upbringing that shapes his worldview and other characteristics? And even after doing this, it'll still only ever be a human interpretation of dwarfishness and not actual experienced dwarfishness. You'll never arrive. And this is because you'll need to react twice in the moment of roleplay. First, you, the player, will need to consider what the dwarf would do, taking you out of the moment and out of the headspace of your character, and then you can react as the dwarf in the moment of roleplay. So you can get closer, but you'll never actually arrive because you'll always need to take that extra step. So while I love dwarves, and they are absolutely my favorite fantasy race, frequently the best decision for me to make while engaging in the activity of roleplay is to play human characters. I can be just as gruff and in my cups as any dwarf, but rather than try to roleplay a flawed interpretation of what a dwarf would actually be that ends up being human anyway, I remove the extra steps and roleplay a human flawlessly. This, of course, hinges solely on what my personal goal for role-playing is during any given game, which is a topic I'll be exploring in a future video. In the meantime, if you disagree, tell me why I'm wrong. Take care.